Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and today I'll be going over the Magicka Dragonknight for the Harrowstorm DLC. MagDK is currently the strongest Magicka DPS class in the game for this patch, and is nearly right there with the strongest Stam classes too. One of the things I've been really enjoying about it is there are a lot of different setups that produce great results, and some work much better than others depending on the situation. I want to start by giving a big thanks to Hibiol, aka Clive, aka Tyrannitar, for sharing his setup with me. They got him to 95k on the trial dummy. It is a bit more difficult dynamic rotation, but I'll go over his tips on it and also cover some alternative rotations that are a bit easier. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to check out some other MagDK guides too. I know Liko and Sparrow both have guides out, and I'm sure they have additional rotation options or information that I'm not covering. I think it's always best to get multiple perspectives on these things to better understand what you're doing and not just blindly follow a singular setup. For this guide, I will cover 4 different builds that I've been using that work really well right now. 3 of them will be utilizing the Perfected Asylum Staff, and then 1 build will be for those who haven't had a chance to get the Perfected Asylum Staff yet. I'll go over the optimal race and Mundus, food and potions, gear setups, skills, the rotations, CP, and end the video with the Cloudrest Gryphon Heart Run from the MagDK perspective. Alright, let's get started. For race, the best option is High Elf, followed very closely by Dark Elf and then Khajiit. I'll put Breton 4th for this patch with all of the setups that use the Perfected Asylum Staff because Sustain is already really good and Breton is really not necessary. I still think Breton can be really good for newer players and those who don't yet have the Asylum Perfected Staff, but for veteran players, I definitely recommend High Elf due to the extra spell damage and the spell recharge passive, which gives back 640 stamina roughly every 6 seconds and allows you to be more aggressive with bash weaving. Dark Elf is really close though, only 125 Magicka behind, and has a bigger stam pool to also allow for a good amount of bash weaving, just not as much as High Elf. For the food, we're going to go with Artaeum Pickled Fish Bowl, or you can also use the standard blue Bistat food, though it is a little bit worse. For the non-perfected Asylum build, we will be using Clockwork Citrus, or you can use Witch Mothers, which is also a little worse than Clockwork. For the potions, we're running Spell Power plus Spell Crit plus Magicka. And just a note, if you do have Inner Light on your front bar and either Inner Light or Flames of Oblivion on your back bar, you can forego the Spell Crit line on these potions and save a little bit of money. Another option is to run the potions that give you Magicka plus Stamina plus Heroism. You will need to make sure that you have your crit buff and that someone is running Igneous Weapons so that you get your spell power buff. For the Mundus, we're going with the Shadow. And then for Vampirism, it's really personal preference. I haven't found Vampirism to be necessary with these setups. Sustain is fine without it. It could be a little dicey on the non-perfected Asylum setup, so you might want to go Vamp there, but it's really up to you. It's not necessary. Before we get into the gear sets, I'll quickly go over why we use the Asylum Staff on DK and compare Bloodthirsty, Infused, and Arcane Jewelry. The reason the Asylum Staff synergizes so well with DKs is because of the Combustion passive. Since this passive has no cooldown, it allows for a ton of sustain and a ton of damage from burning. It's also nice using Force Pulse instead of Whip because it allows us to not have to be melee at all times and we can still attack when the enemy is away. Force Pulse also has really nice cleave damage. For the jewelry traits, Bloodthirsty is usually the best option for most situations and definitely does the most DPS when you take away outside factors and parse on the trial dummy. If you happen to be in a scenario where your execute is really short, say you're the only DK and there are several Necros and Nightblades in the group, you could see better results going 3 Infused. This is highly dependent on the fight and your group composition. I usually like to have a set of both and mix and match as needed. As for Arcane, it is just slightly worse than Infused, but since you have to transmute the Elf Bane jewels anyways because they come in the healthy trait, you'll want to go Infused for upfront DPS or Bloodthirsty for execute DPS. For jewels that already drop in Arcane, like False God and Mother's Sorrow, the DPS difference between Arcane and Infused is really small, so only worry about making the change if you are sitting on a bunch of transmute crystals. The first gear setup we'll go over is based around Elf Bane. Elf Bane got a really nice buff this patch to extend flame abilities from 2 seconds up to 5 seconds. This can be nice on several classes, but it's especially good on MagDK. For the gear, we're using a 2-piece Zon or Grothdarr, 5-piece Elf Bane, on the legs and chest and the jewelry, a 3-piece False God's Devotion, and then Asylum Inferno Staff on the front bar, precise with Ravage Health Poisons, and a Maelstrom Inferno Staff on the back bar infused with a weapon damage enchant. To maximize your resistances, you definitely want one of the Elfbane pieces to be the chest piece, and then for the second piece, it can be either the legs or the feet. They give the same resistances, so it doesn't matter. This is the gear setup. They got Hibiol, the 95k parse on the raid dummy with Zon, and also this insane 86k single target, 105k AoE parse with Grothdarr on Yolnahkrin. This is currently the highest publicly logged parse for that fight on ESO logs. I also use this setup with Grothdarr to get a 68k parse in VCR +3, which as of this recording is the highest logged parse in the Harrowstorm patch for the fight. I know it's not nearly as impressive as the 86k on Yoln, but it is a personal best for me and I'm pretty happy with it. Before we move on to the next setup, I did want to go over a couple of variations to this. You could also drop your monster set and just run a 5-piece False God, so your head and shoulders would be False God. Or you can drop False God altogether and run Siroria as well. The next setup we'll go over is based around New Moon Acolyte. We'll be running a 5-piece New Moon, 5-piece False Gods, an Asylum Staff, precise with Ravage Health Poisons, and a Maelstrom Inferno Staff infused with the weapon damage enchant. To maximize resistances, we'll go heavy on the chest with New Moon since it's craftable, and then for the medium piece, you can choose either your head, shoulders, legs, or feet. With this setup, Hibiol currently has the top publicly logged parse for Asylum Sanctorium, which is pretty impressive considering he was an interrupter. This setup is really nice in instances like Asylum, where you aren't going to get the full benefit of the extra dots from Elfbane due to boss immunity phases. The downside to this setup is that you aren't able to wear a monster set with it. So in situations where you aren't receiving combat prayer, you won't be able to slot Slimecraw for Minor Berserk. You'll need to slot Camo Hunter on your bar instead. This also doesn't allow for Iceheart if you wanted to play a little more defensively. If you do want a monster set for scenarios like these, that leads us into our next setup. This setup will be based around the Willpower set. We'll be running a 3-piece Willpower on the jewelry, a 5-piece False God or Siroria on the body, Asylum Inferno Staff precise with Ravage Health Poisons, and a Maelstrom Inferno Staff infused with a weapon damage enchant. Most of the time you'll be running Slimecraw if you're using this setup, but I also see people using it with Iceheart and Zon. Willpower plus Slimecraw should be stronger than the New Moon setup, assuming you don't have a source of Minor Berserk. If you do have Minor Berserk and don't need another monster set for some reason, the New Moon setup should provide better results. And finally, this setup will be for those who do not have the perfect Asylum Staff. Unfortunately, the non-perfect version is a pretty big drop-off from the perfect version. You can still use it, but in my testing, you drop from about 900 Magicka per second from combustion to about 500 per second. Your burning DPS also drops about roughly 4k. Since we're losing the regen, you'll most likely have to switch to regen food or slot consuming trap to use on the adds for additional sustain. Taking this into account, if you can be in melee range the whole time, Whip is the better spammable to use than Force Pulse if you don't have the perfect Asylum Staff. Whip hits harder and it costs less. I got the best results with Whip with 5-piece Siroria, 5-piece Mother's Sorrow, and a 2-piece Zon. Ideally, you'll want your front bar to be Siroria, but if you don't have that staff, you can still use Mother's Sorrow. I found that Precise and Charged both did about the same DPS. So with Charge, you get more combustion procs and more burning damage, so your sustain is better, but with Precise, everything else does a little more damage. For using Force Pulse, I got the best results with a 5-piece Siroria, 5-piece Mechanical Acuity, and a 2-piece Zon. And for this setup, you use Acuity on the front bar and hope that it procs mainly during your Force Pulse spams. I found the average crit between Acuity and Sorrow to be pretty similar, and with Acuity, you get a little bit more spell damage. This pairs especially well with Siroria, since Siroria does not have any crit lines on it, so when Mechanical Acuity procs, you're not losing any of the bonuses from Siroria. And as I said before, running the Charge trait will hopefully lead to a lot more combustion procs. It doesn't come close to the extra regen that the Asylum Staff provides, but it does give a decent amount plus extra burning DPS. Just make sure that you're either using Mother's Sorrow or Acuity if you run the charged trait, otherwise your crit will be too low without precise. Now let's stop to take a minute and see what we got in our Ouroboros Crown Crate. Now we'll go through the skills, and I'll start with the Elf Bane setup. In the front bar, we're running Inner Light, Scalding Rune, Burning Talons, Force Pulse, Flames of Oblivion, and Shooting Star. In the back bar, we're running Eruption, Wall of Elements, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Barbed Trap, and Standard of Might. With Wall of Elements, you can go with either Morph, and I'll go over that later in the rotations. I did want to note a bug with Talons. Only one person in the group can use it currently, so make sure you coordinate that beforehand. And there's also a bug with the Perfect Asylum staff with Force Pulse. If you bar swap before it hits, it won't apply the effect. So just make sure it hits before you go to your back bar. Another option for this setup is to move Eruption to your front bar in place of Rune. And then on your back bar, you can either double bar Inner Light, slot a shield, or slot a heal. Orb is also a really great skill to run in raid. It just doesn't work nearly as well on the raid dummy. You can also go full Mad Lad and slot Rune and Orb, but it's a lot of dots to keep up, but it can give you some really good results. This is the setup that Hibiol used in the Yolnahkriin fight. Then in a lot of situations, you'll want to run Channeled Acceleration in place of Trap. And then in VCR, since the single target dots stay on Zamaja when she ports, I like to swap these skills around since I have to relay my ground dots down every time she ports anyways. Then I can refresh Engulfing and Burning Embers from my front bar. I also like to use Destro ult instead of Standard because the enemies never seem to sit in place long enough to take the full advantage of the Standard, since it's now 25 seconds with Elf Bane. The 12 seconds on Destro ult seems to line up really well though and do a ton of damage. For most other situations, you'll want to use Standard though in place of Destro ult. Now we'll go over the non-Elf Bane skill bar setup. We're going to use Inner Light, Eruption, Scalding Rune, Force Pulse, Flames of Oblivion, and Shooting Star. And then on the back bar, Inner Light, Blockade of Fire, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Barbed Trap, and Standard of Might. Wall of Elements can also be either morph with this setup. You can also run Orb here in place of Rune. And like the last setup, you'll want to run Channeled Acceleration in place of Trap, depending on the fight. If you don't want to run Slime Crawl, you can often get away with dropping a skill to put on Camo Hunter as well, especially in Asylum, where it can be punishing to have to go into melee to apply abilities anyway. And finally, I'll go over the skill bar setup that I used for slotting Whip. I think there's probably some other skill setups that work as well, but this is the one that got me the best results. Front bar Inner Light, Burning Embers, Engulfing Flames, Molten Whip, Scalding Rune, and Shooting Star. And on the back bar, Molten Whip, Eruption, Blockade of Fire, Flames of Oblivion, Barbed Trap, and Standard of Might. Using Molten Whip on the back bar to get the passive on both bars. And then you can also run Orb on the front bar in place of Rune. And one setup I've seen people do is put Flames of Oblivion on the front bar, and that will free up your back bar to either run Rune or double bar Inner Light, or you could put a shield or a heal there. Now we'll go over the rotations. We'll start with the more advanced rotation provided by Hibiol. This is the one he used for his 95k parse. So we'll pre-buff with Flames of Oblivion and Scalding Rune, and then for the opening rotation, we'll cast Trap, Unstable Wall, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Bar Swap, Talons, Bar Swap, Standard, and then Eruption, Bar Swap, and then 6 Force Pulses, followed by another Flames of Oblivion. It's at this point in the rotation we will recast Unstable Wall a little bit early to line it up on the same 15-second timer as Flames of Oblivion. This separates dot cast retimings, and the early wall refresh puts 2 wall explosions and Eruption's initial damage under the Standard of Might buff. From this point forward, the rotation is dynamic, and dots are kept up as needed. Trap, Engulfing, and Burning Embers are grouped and cast together, and Flames of Oblivion and Unstable Wall are grouped and cast together. Make sure to recast Scalding Rune early if it will fall off when you're recasting your other dots. Now we'll go over another rotation for Elf Bane that is a little bit easier but doesn't have quite the damage ceiling. You'll pre-buff with Flames of Oblivion and Scalding Rune, and then you'll cast Trap, Eruption, Blockade, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Bar Swap, Talons, Bar Swap, Standard of Might, Bar Swap, 6 Force Pulses, Flames of Oblivion, Talons, 3 Force Pulses, Bar Swap. From here out, the remaining rotation is Trap, Blockade, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Bar Swap, Scalding Rune, and those are always grouped together. And then you'll have time for 13 spammables, and you'll replace the Force Pulse cast with Talons, Eruption, or Standard of Might whenever they need to be refreshed. You can also make this a fully static rotation by casting Eruption early each time and just only casting Talons on specific intervals. If you're running Orb with the rotation, you will have to keep it up dynamically since it's on a 10-second timer. If you need a flex spot for a shield or a heal, you can move Eruption to your front bar in place of Rune, and then put the flex spot on your back bar. The only difference in the rotation is we'll be dropping Rune, and so you'll have an extra spammable. You'll have 14 instead of 13. For the non-Elf Bane setup, we're pre-buffing with Flames of Oblivion and Rune, and then casting Trap, Blockade, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Standard, Bar Swap, Eruption, and then 7 Force Pulses. And then the remaining rotation will be a 15-second rotation based around Flames of Oblivion. So we'll cast Flames of Oblivion, Bar Swap, Blockade, Engulfing, and Burning Embers, Bar Swap, Rune, and then spam Force Pulses until Flames of Oblivion needs to be reapplied. Then you'll replace Force Pulse with Trap or Eruption whenever they run out. You can also do this as a 14-second rotation, but then you'll just have to reapply Flames of Oblivion dynamically. And finally, I'll go over a completely static rotation for using Whip. You'll pre-buff with Flames of Oblivion 3 times and then cast Rune, and then start the rotation with Trap, Eruption, Blockade, Bar Swap, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Bar Swap, Standard of Might, Bar Swap, and then 6 whips. The remaining rotation will be Blockade, Flames of Oblivion, Bar Swap, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Rune, Bar Swap, Trap, Eruption, Bar Swap, and then whip 7 times if you are under 0.95 light attacks a second, or 8 if you are over that threshold. This rotation does cast Trap and Eruption early to keep it static, but you're welcome to keep up those abilities dynamically to squeeze out a little more DPS. For the CP, we're doing 49 Elemental Expert, 61 Elfborn, 10 Spell Erosion, 56 Master at Arms, 19 Staff Expert, 72 Thaumaturge, and 3 Piercing. We're putting the 3 into Piercing to make sure we get the Exploiter passive to get 10% extra damage against off-balance enemies. Well, that's going to be the end of this guide. Thank you for sticking with me. I know this one was a little longer than usual. I just felt like there was a lot to unpack on DK and wanted to make sure I got out all the stuff I felt was important. Here's a Gryphon Heart Run I was in a few days ago from the Mag DK perspective. It definitely wasn't my best performance on DPS, and just don't pay any attention to me nearly nuking the group with the bar swap mechanic. But we got it. Congrats to the raid team, Krusty Bread Bakers, the longest running raid team in Wipes on Trash. See you guys in the next one. Bye.
Don't you just love that 1K shield that you get every 20 seconds or whatever?
There's so many red and blue balls floating around the screen.
Alright, I got it. Thanks.
And I'm glad we have Olarime and Reliquin in the picture.